Well, thank you, everybody. It falls to me to give some words of welcome to our speakers and to you all, and thank you for coming. My name's Rachel Gibson. I'm a professor in the Department of Politics here at Manchester, and I'm also convener of the Democracy and Elections group, which is sort of primarily responsible for bringing this event to you. I'd just like to say a few words of introduction and also recognition of the other groups that have been involved in organising this event. As I said, Democracy and Elections is a group of political scientists and social scientists, sociologists across the university studying democracy, citizen participation in elections, and we're based in the politics discipline area, and also within the Cathy Marsh Institute for Social Research, which is a University of Manchester research institute actually directed by my colleague Tarani, focusing on quantitative social science in the UK and also internationally. And another sponsor, of course, is Achieving, the UK's government global scholarship programme, which makes awards to outstanding scholars with leadership potential from around the world to study postgraduate courses here in the UK. So we thank all of our sponsors for today's event. I'd like to just briefly introduce our speakers, or conversationalists, I don't know, maybe that's a better word. It is an enormous privilege to welcome Peter Tatchell to Manchester. Peter, as I'm sure most of you will know, has been campaigning and advocating for human rights and social justice for, I think, 50 years, I have down in my notes. During that time, he's been a tireless advocate and campaigner for various campaigns, particularly in support of the rights of lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgendered individuals. And as no introduction for him, I think, would be complete without reference to his famous attempt at citizens' arrest of Robert Mugabe twice, in 1999 and 2001. And probably actions that led to the New Statesman readers voting him 6th on their list of heroes of our time. In 2012, he was awarded the Owen Prize for the from the National Secular Society in recognition of his lifelong commitment to the defence of human rights against religious fundamentalism. And we are extremely, as I said, delighted and pleased to have him here tonight to give us his reflections on the forthcoming general election, the choices that we face, but also to reflect really more widely on the health of democracy in the UK. His interrogator, is Professor Tarani Chandola, a friend and colleague at the University of Manchester. Tarani is Professor of Medical Sociology and Director of the Cathy Marsh Institute for Social Research, as I said, here at the university. He's also the co-director of Methods at Manchester, which is a network promoting quantitative research in social sciences. And he's also Secretary of the Social Statistics Committee of the Royal Statistical Society. Tarani's work is quite wide-ranging. He focuses primarily on the social determinants of health and health inequalities, and an analysis of complex longitudinal cohort studies to study this. And he has done a lot of work on stress at work and its effects on health. The format of the event will be that we'll start with an hour of conversation between Tarani and Peter, and then we'll switch to have question and answer for about half an hour at the end. Just to say as well that there's no fire alarms expected. So if there is a fire alarm, then you need to leave the building. And the assembly point, as I understand it, is as you come into the building, there are exits to the left of the building, which will take you out. If you stand at Oxford Road looking towards University Place, the easiest one is the side exit. And we have it looks like a grassy knoll next to the Kilburn building to assemble at. So that's just some sort of housekeeping. So rather than take any more time, I will hand the floor to Tarani and Peter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. Peter, welcome again, and thank you once again for coming to Manchester. I've been a long time admirer of your politics. Personally, I'm deeply honored that you've come for today's event. There have been a series of questions that people have mailed in advance, so I think we'll go through them and see what your thoughts on them are. The very first one is Russell Brand. What do you think about Russell Brand? Do you think he's right about voting or not voting in the elections? Are we being disenfranchised by our politicians?
Well, for anybody who hasn't seen Russell Brand's confrontation with Jeremy Paxman on Newsnight, I'd recommend that you go to YouTube and watch it. I think Russell's critique of the system is pretty much spot on. It's a really damning, powerful indictment of the way in which politics and economics is rigged in this country against ordinary people. Where I disagree with Russell is about not voting. I can understand entirely why he says that people shouldn't vote. You know, if you look at the system and the way it operates, you know, his view is whoever you vote for, the system will maintain the essential sameness as in decades past. And that is true. But at the end of the day, it's only by voting that we have a mechanism to ensure a government that will change things. And I agree entirely that the big three parties, Labour, Conservative and Liberal Democrat, are pretty much similar. There are some differences, but not really substantive ones. But at the end of the day, you know, we have to try and build an alternative political party or force that can advocate and bring about those changes. So I think voting is very important, and there are some parties, like the SNP, Plaid Cymru, Sinn Féin, the Green Party, the Trade Union Socialist Campaign. Those are all parties that are offering something different from the big three. And my own personal support is for the Green Party, but I accept entirely that other people may make other choices. I think the important thing is not to vote for the parties that have been in and out of power for decades, but to vote for parties that represent some real substantive change.
Okay. I think kitchens are emerging as a big theme of this year's voting behavior, with Russell Brand and Ed Miliband's kitchens being in the news. We're going to throw it up to questions. So if anybody has any strong feelings about Russell Brand, what he represents, what he talks about, or do you think he's a force for good, or maybe not a force for good? Should politicians be being engaged with Russell Brand and his type of anti-politics view? Does anybody have strong feelings about his inclusion? Did I see a hand going up there? Yes?
Yeah, I just thought I'd say that on the latest episode of Cruise that me and my friend watched today, the latest episode of Cruise that he does online,
Yep.
he essentially endorsed Caroline Lucas and also endorsed like the whole like Green Party in Brighton. So I just wanted to say that he is saying vote for Caroline in Brighton, so he's not saying
I see.
not vote like altogether.
And has that influenced your opinion?
Well, I'm a Green Party member, so.
Okay. I do have to say we have to steer away from very party political messages. So yeah, don't say vote for so and so.
I think going back to the whole thing about not voting, one of the whole issues is that the Chartists and the suffragettes fought precisely so that we would have the right to vote and be able to change things. The sad thing is the way in which the political system has been corrupted so that we have an unfair voting system for a start, and secondly, all the main parties are fighting over the centre ground. And as you all know, in preceding elections, it would have only taken somewhere between 15 to 30,000 people to switch votes in key marginals for there to be a different outcome. And that means that for the vast majority of people, their votes don't really count. So I'm sure the suffragettes and the Chartists, if they were alive today and were looking at us, they would see this system that we have as not being the system they would have wanted. They wanted to give people power, and right now, under the way we do politics, most people don't have power and don't have the capacity to change things.
Question from here?
I didn't see the Russell Brand program, but I have read several of his articles. It seems to me that the problem with Russell Brand, and I think significantly of many of the kind of protests against the system that we actually have, that we get lots of indications, in other words, about what we are against, but I get very, very little clarity about what they really stand for. And I think that is symptomatic, I think, of an intellectual and political confusion about what is really the problem with the system. And perhaps, obviously, the speaker may well actually, in fact, sort of elaborate precisely, well, what is it actually at the roots of it? I don't mean just here in this country. In Italy, where I live, one can point to many of the same symptoms, and elsewhere, throughout Europe, if not globally. And I would really like to see, in fact, much more concrete clarity about precisely, well, what is the alternative?
Okay.
We need to know what is the problem, and we need to know the political alternative, not only nationally, on a European scale, but also globally.
We'll take one more question at the back.
Yeah, sorry, I personally reject the assertion that first past the post means that we can't affect change. It means that change is difficult to affect under the system that we have. But if everyone here got involved in a political party, and instead of going to this 1.5 hour meeting talk, they spent an hour and a half of their month campaigning for a political party, then change could be affected. First past the post maybe creates the illusion and pacifies people, but change really can be affected, and I do reject that assertion.
Peter, what are your thoughts on any of these?
Well, I think we're going to come on to those.
Yes,
I think
that's
there
right,
are further questions addressing both the people who have made points there.
That's right.
Yeah.
So let's just save that for in one or two questions times. I've got the second question here about economic democracy and inequalities. Does politics need to be more responsive to our economic needs? Is there an understanding there that politics has failed to be about addressing social inequalities, addressing poverty? That's been a failure.
Excuse me, we can't hear what you're saying. Why is there so much difference between Mr. Tatchell and you when you're speaking? We can hear him.
I will try to speak up. I was told I was mic'd up, but yes, okay. The second question is about, does politics need to be more responsive to our economic needs? Peter, what are your thoughts on this?
My opening gambit is that we all expect political democracy. Why can't we have economic democracy as well? There's a separate issue about the way in which economics rules politics. I mean, basically, the big three parties are in hock to big corporations. Time and time again, the very rich tell politicians, if you do X, Y, and Z, we'll leave the country, we'll pull out the investment. That is not democracy. That is very rich and powerful people using their economic clout to subvert democracy and to force political leaders to follow their agenda. But on the wider issue of economic democracy, I would say that Britain is, in essence, an economic dictatorship. A handful of very rich, powerful people control all the key economic decisions of this country. The major shareholders, the leading directors and managers, they have all the say. And it's not just in the private sector, it's also in the public sector. Because even a valued institution like the National Health Service is run along the lines of private enterprise where the key people at the top make all the decisions and the frontline service deliverers, the nurses and doctors and janitors and others, have virtually no say whatsoever about the way in which public services are run and delivered. Now, if you look at economic decision-making, as I said, it's basically a tyranny of the very rich and powerful. I would like to see and believe that ethically it's right that the economic system was in closer alignment with at least what the political system aspires to be. So, over the centuries, from the Civil War and the Great English Revolution of the 17th century onwards, we have progressively extended political democracy. but there hasn't been a parallel extension in terms of economic democracy. So there's a disjunction between the way the economy is run and the way politics is run. And that's even despite the flaws in the political system and the way it operates. I would like to see things like, for example, a legal requirement that all public and private institutions with more than 50 employees should be required by law to have on their management boards at least 1/3 employee and consumer directors with full access to corporate information and full voting rights over key decision making. That to me would be a step towards economic democracy. It would give the right of ordinary people in both public and private institutions to elect representatives, to sit on the boards, to be able to present the interest of their members, and in the case of consumer directors, the right to represent the interests of consumers and the wider public. Now, I'm sure that if such a system had been in place, say 10 years ago, those directors, if they'd been on the board of Northern Rock or RBS, would have been able to blow the whistle on the reckless, irresponsible decisions that the directors were taking. They may have been able to vote them down, and if they hadn't, they could blow the whistle and publicly expose them. And that might have saved this country from the economic meltdown that we suffered from 2008. You all know, I'm sure, that the German economy has a system called the Works Council, where employee representatives sit with management and have some degree of co-determination. It's not exactly the kind of system that I would like to see. It's not as radical as I would like to see, but it is a step in the right direction and does mean, on the whole, that employees have greater bargaining power when it comes to wages and conditions than in Britain. It also means that German enterprises are more productive because a lot of the glitches and problems in economic enterprises are resolved because the grassroots employees know and understand the problems, they take it to the Works Council, they get it discussed, and often, not always, but often, they get it resolved. And, Germany on the whole does have better industrial relations as a consequence. Fewer days lost by strike and other forms of industrial action. So I'm not holding up the Works Council system as a panacea. It's weaker than I would like, but I think that's the direction we need to go. Another idea I'll quickly throw out is the idea that employees should have control of their own pension funds. At the moment, pension funds, which account for 1/3 of the entire stock market, around about 900 or so billion pounds, are hived off to private corporate interests. Aviva and all Axia and all these different big companies, they run the pension funds as part of their corporate portfolio. And they're basically motivated by profit for them as much as a return for the people investing their pensions. Now, I would say that I'd prefer that control over pension funds to be decentralized and devolved to, let's say, regional employee mutual societies, which would have control over their members' pension funds, obviously get them run by financial experts, but within the parameters they decide. One of the consequences of this would be, first of all, it would be a counterbalance to the huge weight of big business. And secondly, it would help, I think, result in investment decisions where employees, mindful of their own communities and long-term interests, might make wiser investment decisions. So say, for example, there was an employee mutual society for the Northwest. Being aware of the needs of the Northwest, they'd probably invest it in the Northwest rather than in London or Shanghai or wherever, because they'd be mindful that those investment decisions would have an effect upon their communities. And obviously they would like to get a good return, but they're also mindful that they could invest the money in a way to boost the local economy, which would help end the lopsided economy we have, where London dominates the entire rest of the country. So those are just a couple of ideas about how we might move towards a system of economic democracy. I am sure the greater minds than mine will be able to refine and improve them.
Peter, can I just pick up on some of those points? About the co-op and the struggle it's been in the last few years. It's a very proud northern brand, and yet it's been financially not doing very well in the last few years. It has had really, this idea of shop floor representation at all levels of decision making. So it's fulfilling the first of your criteria. But here's an example of a major financial company that's not doing well at all. Part of the reasons that have been established, have been suggested, is that those shop floor employees who are sitting at decision boards may not have had the right sort of training. It's really hard to be, if you see people who have had a university education. How are you supposed to, you're working at at a checkout counter. How are you going to be empowered to say, well, actually, I think you've got your sum wrong? So is what you're proposing a bit of a utopia when we know that it's possibly failed in the case of the co-op? I'm going to just leave it there as a suggestion, because I know a lot of people have strong links to the co-op here, or may have other suggestions that they would like to bring in.
Can I just say,
Yep.
I don't think the co-op had the kind of model that I'm proposing.
Okay.
And of course, the model that I'm proposing is not a panacea. It all depends on who the employees elect. If they elect people who are not up to the job, then the system's going to fail. It's their responsibility to elect people who will be on the ball, will know their business, and if they don't know it, as you say, get proper training and advice from people who do.
Sure. We're opening up to questions. Yes, over here.
The point was made earlier that politicians are often kind of subject to kind of threats or leverage from big businessmen, and it's kind of rhetoric we hear an awful lot. It's Russell Brand's message a lot of the time. I was just wondering if you could give any empirical examples, because we hear all the time politics is run by big businessmen. That's who's really in charge. I've heard that statement so many times, but I've never heard an actual example of it.
Well, there have been many examples. Before the last election, lots of business people said if Labour was re-elected, they would pull out their investment from the country. And indeed, even now, there are some business people who are making murmurs that if Labour was elected and implemented its tax policies, that they would be inclined to move elsewhere. HSBC, a world major bank, is thinking of pulling out from London precisely for these reasons. I would say we have to call a spade a spade. This is economic blackmail by big business. Big business is saying, if you don't do what we want, if you implement what you're saying, we will withdraw. And this is constantly being used time and time again against the smaller left progressive parties who argue for stronger controls and taxation on the very rich. As you know, Boots, the chemist, relocated from Britain, from Nottingham, its original base, to a low-tax canton in Switzerland. And so therefore, they're avoiding paying not millions, but billions in tax, which to me is absolutely outrageous. If I was Chancellor, a very unlikely prospect, I admit, if I was Chancellor, I would have said to Boots, okay, you are free to relocate to your low-tax canton in Switzerland. But quite clearly, you have no genuine loyalty to this country. You're not patriotic, you don't believe in Britain, you're just after the fastest possible buck for your directors and your shareholders. In that case, we don't want you to trade in Britain anymore. We are going to seize your shops to make up for all the tax you've avoided. We're not going to close the shops down. We're going to give them, for the workers, the employers, the employees, to turn into employee cooperatives. I think we need to stop allowing this country being blackmailed by big business. We need to call the shots and tell them, with great wealth comes great responsibility. And if you love this country, you have a duty to pay your fair share of tax. Now that is part of, obviously, a much wider project, which is to close down the tax avoidance loopholes, to close down transfer pricing and profiteering, and to close tax havens worldwide. And obviously, ideally, we need international consensus on that. And a couple of years back, the European Union did actually move in that direction. But sadly, countries like Britain, the current Liberal Democrat Conservative coalition, scuppered those plans. I just think we need to call the shots and say that this is not right and not fair.
Okay. So, well, got a few claps for that. I mean, the question about, you mentioned Boots, but, speaking as somebody that works a lot on the topic of work stress, the pharmacy industry, the pharmacy sector is one that is particularly affected by big multinational companies. So the idea of sort of the pharmacist working by, as an entrepreneur no longer exists, and they're increasingly under the pressure from big multinational companies because of their employers, and there's a really high degree of stress levels amongst pharmacists working here in the UK, which seems really, really ironic. But anyways, I just want to get that in and go on to the next question about austerity. So does the broad consensus on austerity across the three main parties reflect the will of the British people? So first of all, do you think that the three main parties have a broad consensus on austerity? And if so, does this reflect what most British people want?
I don't know of any absolutely conclusive polls, but I think the evidence is that most people disagree with austerity, the idea that ordinary poor, low-income, middle-income people should pay for the crisis caused by the bankers. Of course, some of them are then persuaded that that may be true, but we have to cut back, it's a necessary price for the sake of recovery. Well, that quite clearly is absolute nonsense. We have had all these years of austerity, and look what has happened to the national debt. Under this government, the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition, with their austerity program to reboot the economy and to get the economy back on track, the national debt has increased from £900 billion to £1,400 billion. A 50% increase in the space of 5 years. Austerity has failed. And you don't have to be a Nobel Prize winning economist, although that might help, to understand that. John Maynard Keynes and Franklin Delano Roosevelt understood very clearly how to get economies back in shape. They said, even in desperate, dire times, you have to invest to reboot the economy. And just think, Britain after the Second World War was on its knees. Yet we managed to rebuild the economy, introduce the welfare state, the National Health Service. Just think about the current strategy of the current government, and indeed the Labour light version. As a result, many more people are unemployed than would otherwise be. Many people are on zero-hour contracts, or working part-time. That doesn't make economic sense. The more people you have on the dole, the fewer people are supporting themselves and paying national insurance and tax. Instead, they have to be paid benefits. So the net loss to the exchequer and to the economy is huge. Having people unemployed means a big increase in benefit costs and a huge loss in national insurance and taxation. Getting people back to work, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt did in the United States in the 1930s, actually reboosts and revives the economy, because those people no longer have to claim benefits, they're earning money, they're paying tax, they're paying national insurance, which boosts government revenue, which decreases the deficit. And because they got more money to spend in their pockets, they go out and spend it, which encourages new businesses to set up and to employ more people. It's easy peasy economics. Yet the big three parties are wedded to this absurd anti-economic theory that austerity is the solution. It's not, it's the problem. And I just think that, we have to go back to the masters, John Maynard Keynes, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and others, and recognize their successful strategy, which is you have to sometimes spend more and borrow more in order to reboot the economy. So, for example, one idea might be, there's a number of ideas. First of all, let's cancel the Trident nuclear missile program and save £100 billion over 40 years. Let's cancel HS2 and save a further £50 billion. And let's spend some of that money to upgrade the existing services to make them better, but not spend $50 billion on HS2 in order to reduce a journey time by 20 or 30 minutes. Let's also close the tax avoidance loopholes, which would bring in a minimum of another £20 billion every year. Let's end pension tax relief on people earning more than £150,000 a year, which would bring in another $20 billion every year. And then let's have a financial transaction tax on currencies, bonds, shares, and commodities. If you set it at 0.05%, that's 1/20th of 1%, you would raise a minimum of £50 billion every year, and probably actually closer to 100 billion. And then the final idea is a one-off wealth tax on the mega rich. A one-off wealth tax at an average of 20% on the assets of the richest 5% of the British population. It would be graduated, so people at the lower end would probably only pay 1 or 2%, but the people at the very top end might pay 25% or even 30%. That would raise £400 billion. £400 billion to invest in new jobs, to reboot the economy. That is a staggering amount of money. So if you add up all those things together, it's over 600 billion. Over 600 billion pounds. And some of them are one-off savings, and some of them are recurrent. But if that money was invested in, for example, the Green New Deal, which is to create new jobs in renewable energy and energy conservation, it would create hundreds of thousands of new jobs, a mixture of skilled, semi-skilled, and low-skilled, which could be filled by new apprenticeship programs, which would get young people off the dole and into work and earning money. The upshot would be that hundreds of thousands of people would no longer have to claim benefits, which is a drain on the exchequer. They'd be paying tax and national insurance. The whole economy would begin to reboot and revamp. To me, these are pretty obvious common sense ideas if you're not wedded to the mantra of austerity and not wedded to licking the boots of big business. As I said earlier, these are ideas in essence. The fine-tuning, the detail, I'll leave to the greater minds than mine. But I think these ideas have some currency and some credibility.
Would anybody like to volunteer for fine-tuning or challenging Peter about austerity of some of these figures? Yeah.
First of all, I wanted to come back to his point that Keynes' theory about spending more to reboot the economy has been punctured very recently, especially by the Japanese. I'll give you an example. Toyota spends 15% on R&D, but yet their products outclass Ford, which spends as much as 30% on R&D. The issue is not throwing more money at the problem. The issue is productivity, and productivity is based on talent, and talent does not follow democracy. You see, so you have to take into those kind of considerations into the equation. Can British businesses compete with these companies, international companies, with lower operating costs, who are putting less money even into their operations? So the pressure for the managers is how to actually match those international competitors and still keep jobs for the home constituency. And then you look at the question of 20% on the rich, one-off tax to get 400 billion. The question again is, how are we going to decide what percentage? I mean, if we tax 50%, we might as well pay off the entire debt, so.
Okay, a couple of challenges there, but I think there was another question here.
Sorry, who was it? Cheers, mate. So, I think I kind of agree with you, but a lot of the times when I find myself in conversations like this, and people start saying about like, oh, big business do this and we should tax more, the response tends to come, because I don't really know that much about economics. It's like, oh, you don't understand economics. Look at Venezuela. If you try and do this stuff, you'll like end up in a worse situation because the rich will move away. Economic arguments, jargon, you don't understand. Therefore, we need the status quo. So, like, how do you come back at that kind of stuff? And also, do you think it's incompetence or malice on the parts of the main parties?
Peter, what are your thoughts?
On the last point, I think it's primarily fear. The main parties are fearful of how the Daily Mail and other papers will portray them. And there's fear about an exodus by the very rich. But at the end of the day, the very rich have a limited number of places to go. The Cayman Islands might be very nice for a holiday, but I'm sure most very rich people would not like to be permanently based in the Cayman Islands. A beach, after a while, gets rather boring. There's not much culture there. Going back to your point about productivity, I'm glad you raised that. I have another idea about economic democracy, and that is the ideas of the Swedish economist Rudolf Meidner, who should have won a Nobel Prize. But one of his key and very inspiring ideas were what he called wage earner funds. He was an economist with the Swedish equivalent of the TUC. And he devised the idea of what he called wage earner funds, whereby he said that any increase in productivity should be shared between management and employees. That if a company increased its productivity, then employees should share in the value of that added increase. He said it was wrong that if a company boosts its productivity, the shareholders, directors, and managers should get all the bonuses and all the profits. So his idea was about profit sharing. And his idea was that if you give people an incentive and a reward that if they make the company more productive, they will share in the gains, then you will have better industrial relations, more highly motivated workers, and a more efficient company. At the end of the day, the grassroots frontline employees, whether it be in private or public enterprise, often know a lot more about how to make the company efficient than the aloof managers at the top. And I'll give you an example. At my local hospital, my local NHS hospital, St Thomas's, some years ago, they had an appallingly inefficient appointment system which wasted patient time and doctor's time. Everybody knew it. I used to complain, and the staff used to say, we know the system is absurd. We know it's wasteful and inefficient, but we don't have any say. We can't get to sit on the PCT or the other management boards. We can't get an input. We don't have any voting rights. So that exclusion meant that that system continued for about 6 years after people began campaigning and protesting against it. If employees had been on the boards, if they had voting rights, and if there were consumer representatives there to represent the interests of patients, maybe that system would have been reformed much quicker. The other idea I would suggest is, Why should bonuses only be for bankers? If an employee in a public or private institution comes up with a way of improving productivity or reducing costs without diminishing services, they should get a reward. They should get 5 or 10% of the savings. That's a way to incentivize people to be loyal and committed and to help make those enterprises, public and private, work better. The trouble is, the people in the main 3 political parties are not willing to trust ordinary people. They take the view that it's only the technocrats, the consultants, the managers who know anything. That's nonsense. A man who's been working in a factory for 40 years, like my father did, knew more about how to do precision engineering and how to improve the efficiency of the lathe that he operated than any of the managers in his firm. And he eventually, after 35 years, did persuade them to make changes, which if they'd made those changes 35 years previously, would have not only made him much happier, but would actually made the company more profitable.
Okay, Peter, I'd like to come back to this question about first past the post and proportional representation. Do you think there'll ever be a change in the way how elections are decided?
Well, first of all, there's got to be change. As I said earlier, the system we have is not what the Chartists and suffragettes fought for. Under first past the post, it works well if there's only 2 parties. But in a 5 or 7 party system, it's a total failure. On the 7th of May, there'll be many, many MPs who'll be elected on 15, 20, and 25% of the vote. In other words, up to 85% of their constituents will not have voted for them, but they will get power. That is outrageous. In the 2010 election, it took about 33,000 votes to elect a Labour MP, about 35,000 to elect a Tory MP, 119,000 to elect a Liberal Democrat MP, and almost 300,000 votes to elect 1 Green MP. That is not democracy. If you go back to 2005, Labour won less than 36% of the votes, but bagged 55% of the seats. In Scotland, Labour won 40% of the votes, but won 70% of the seats. That's not democracy.
But how do you translate this into a government? You see, if you get all these parties representing the people who voted for them, then when they meet in the smoke-filled rooms after the election, how do you translate that into a workable government that the world is going to have confidence in?
We've had too much strong government. Too much Tony Blair and Margaret Thatcher. I think coalition is a good thing if it represents the spectrum of opinion. Parliament should represent the range of diverse opinions. I don't like UKIP. I disagree with them totally. But if people vote for them, they have a right to members of Parliament. And it'll be absolutely outrageous if 15 or 20% of people vote UKIP and they only get 1 or 2 MPs. Equally be appalling if 10 or 5% of people vote for the Green Party and they only get 1 MP. That's not representative democracy. We have to change the system. And I would say that the Scottish parliamentary election system and the London Assembly system are good models. They're not perfect, but they combine constituency members of Parliament and top up additional MPs. So in London, for example, people vote for a constituency representative on the London Assembly, and then they also vote for a list. And the list is calculated so that if a party has substantial support but got no members of the London Assembly elected via the constituency system, they get a top-up. So that's how we have 2 Green members on the London Assembly. The Greens don't win any members of the London Assembly through the constituency system, but under the top-up system, they get 2. And the same has happened with UKIP and others. That, to me, is a better system. You maintain the constituency link, but you end up with an assembly, a legislature, which is more representative of the spectrum of opinion. And if there is no consensus amongst the public about who should govern, then that has to be reflected in a coalition. And I, for one, I'm looking forward to a coalition between Labour, the SNP, Plaid Cymru, Sinn Féin, the SDLP, and the Greens. That would be a progressive coalition which may not be perfect, but would be a damn sight better than the current system we have, where, in this case at present, two parties have dominated, even though they have not truly had a proper public mandate.
Peter, do you think your wish list of coalition parties will address the biggest challenge of facing us today, which is climate change? Do you think there has been a failure of all political parties to address the biggest threat to people, present and future, and just because of the way how politics is organized in around elections every 5 years, it's too short term. You know, do you think your big coalition there will make any difference?
Well, the problem is, with the big three parties, much of their political agenda is based on focus groups and marginal voters. So they analyze, in the key swing seats, how are people going to vote? What do they want? I argue that a political party should have a set of values, ideals, principles, and policies, and then go out and argue for them. And over time, seek and persuade people. When I began campaigning for LGBT human rights in the 1960s, hardly anybody supported equality for LGBT people. Yet, over a 40-plus year period, myself with many, many other people, we gradually, slowly, but surely persuaded a majority of the public that LGBT people did deserve human rights. The big parties funked it. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, they all ran away from gay rights because they thought it was electorally damaging. So they were just opportunists. They didn't have the courage of their convictions. And on all these issues, what we need is politicians with conviction. And that means on the right as much as the left. At least it gives people a choice. And when people argue with conviction and set out alternatives, people will be able to look at the alternatives, look at the arguments, look at the evidence, and make their decision. I would get rid of focus groups. I would put the marginal constituency to one side. I would talk to the great bulk of British people and argue for what I believe is right. And politicians who do that tend to win respect. One of the reasons why Nigel Farage has some considerable support is because people think he's not like the other politicians, he actually speaks his mind. And I think he speaks a lot of nonsense, but I think he is right. He does speak his mind. And people do like that. They respect that. I just wish people on the left and progressive politics would do the same. I wish Labour would not only turn its back on Blairism, as it's begun to do, but on that whole tradition of cowing to the centre ground. I think, that's what people want. People want politicians who believe sincerely in something and fight for it.
The question on climate change
climate change, I didn't answer that question.
Well, it actually came from Olivia Holterman. Is she here? No? But do you want to come back quickly on climate change? What do you think can be done?
Well, it's true that in terms of national and global security, climate change, or what I prefer to call climate destruction, is the single greatest threat. I mean, what's happening in Syria and Iraq is ghastly and horrible. Putin is a monster, and so on and so on and so on. But at the end of the day, climate destruction, if it happens, it will be a far greater devastation. If the polar ice caps melt and sea levels rise, large parts of Britain will disappear under the waves. Millions of people will have to evacuate from low-lying areas, particularly in Kent and Sussex and parts of Essex. They'll lose their homes, their businesses and jobs. All that farmland will be lost. For us, it'll be devastating, but even more so for poorer people in developing countries. The richest, most fertile, productive parts of this planet are the river deltas. And those river deltas, particularly in South Asia and Southeast Asia, are homes to over 1,000 million people. They will be forced to move. 1,000 million refugees. Where will they go? Homeless, jobless, destitute. It's going to be a catastrophe, a global catastrophe. And that's why we do need to take climate change seriously and maybe suffer a bit of pain in the process. Now, I'm not one who says ban all aeroplanes or ban all cars, but we do have to find alternatives. We do have to make public transport cheap, efficient, reliable, and safe. We need to ensure that people have homes with good insulation. You know, we could cut our energy needs by between 20 and 30% if we had a proper program of energy conservation for houses, offices, and factories. A 20 to 30% reduction in energy needs. No need for new power stations. And of course, the energy conservation program would create at minimum of 100,000 new jobs to get people off the dole and back into work. So it really is a priority, and it's really sad that only the minor parties, like the Greens, are making this a serious public issue.
I think we had a question right at the back. Is that right?
Yeah. I was going to say, who do you think has the most control on the political narrative? The media, politicians, or people?
Well, it's definitely not the people. The average person in this country, and even the collectivity of ordinary people, has almost no say whatsoever. You know, we're given occasional token events, you know, BBC Question Time and so on, but in reality, that's just, you know, a bit of icing on a cake that is controlled, baked, and eaten by the very rich and powerful. And I think it's a totally, you know, it's a version of democracy when there's no real, genuine participation and often no genuine knowledge about what is going on. I'm sure you're all familiar with Noam Chomsky and his idea about the manufacturing of consent, the way in which political elites, the media and business work together to create a consensus around an issue, to demonize and marginalize anybody who challenges the system as it is. Tony Benn, bless him, late great Tony Benn, used to say that what they do when you come up with a challenging idea is, first of all, they just dismiss you. When you don't go away, they demonize you. When you still don't go away, they say you're barking mad. But over time, if you stick to your principles, sometimes they will grudgingly come to some respect and recognition, and sometimes your ideas might get a hearing in the public forum. But it's only sometimes. It's only sometimes. The main narrative of this election is pretty much that austerity is inevitable, that there's no alternative. The Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats, and even Labour buy into that narrative. Labour will cut less, Labour will do a bit more, but essentially they're going to cut just as the other two are as well. We need to start having that conversation, as we are here tonight, about what the alternatives might be. And we need to get those voices heard. We need to get them heard not just in the media, but in every aspect of public and community life. The sad thing is, mostly with this election debate, it's the media that dictates the terms. When I listen to the Day programme, PM programme, you know, 2 flagship news programmes by the BBC, they do a lot of good stuff. but they also buy a lot into the Westminster Village and the gossip there. They do give an occasional voice to a dissenting point of view, but not very often. And one of the really shocking things that really, really angered me was when we had the meltdown with the banks in 2007, 2008. First of all, initially, there were no platforms given to any alternative critics. But eventually there were. But the critics they chose were the critics that you identified, the critics who had the criticism, but not the alternative answers. And oppositionism and negative politics can never, ever win. You'll only have credibility if you critique the system and offer a credible alternative. Now, I'm not claiming the ideas that I've suggested tonight are the alternative, but perhaps they're part of the alternative, and perhaps, as I said, others with greater minds than mine can come up with even better alternatives. But we've got to have alternatives, and those alternatives have to be heard. We've got to stop Newsnight and Channel 4 News and others basically rehashing the debate between the big three parties and excluding alternative critical voices who have credible alternative ideas.
Even if the alternative is UKIP. So there's a question here from Karen Graham. Is Karen here? Yeah, so Karen's asking about, do you think the mainstream parties have actually fostered the rise of UKIP, an alternative voice, because they've dismissed sentiments around immigration too long, and that's generally resulted in the rise of UKIP and more generally perhaps more racist attitudes in general?
UKIP is the bastard child of the big three parties. With apology to all bastards. UKIP exists because the big three parties have failed. And you see it all across Europe. The rise of right-wing nationalist parties, anti-immigrant parties, which pick on and scapegoat and demonize immigrants and refugees. They're all responding to a failure of the major parties. It is pretty damning that Margaret Thatcher built more council houses than Tony Blair. Labour and the left in general has a lot to answer for. A lot to answer for. And you see it all across Europe. The Front National in France. It's responding to the failure not only of the right, but of the left. The Socialist Party in France is an abject failure. And what is truly shocking is that in this vacuum, people have gone to the right rather than the left. Because the right has played on populist fears and the left hasn't had a credible answer. Now, I would suggest that when people have jobs with decent incomes, good public services, cheap, affordable homes, a good future, they're probably less inclined to vote far right. They're probably less inclined to support those extremist parties. So if we had a serious council house building program, we wouldn't have the housing crisis we currently experience. If we'd had investment in new jobs, we wouldn't have so many people unemployed on 0-hour contracts and on the minimum wage. Then I think the right parties like UKIP would have less appeal. I'm not saying they would have no appeal, because there is a xenophobic streak in British society, as in all societies. But I think if you give people hope and give people a decent livelihood, they're less likely to blame the other. They're less likely to look to other vulnerable people and point to them as the problem.
Karen, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks for that research. It's really interesting, and you're right, because there is a massive gap that's been left of generations actually that have been brought up with nothing since the Thatcher years particularly. That's where the far right capitalised. One thing that interesting what you were talking about before about solutions on bringing people into to the table with employers is that you didn't touch much on trade unionism. Now, given that employment law and trade union law has been severely weakened over the last decade, where do we go? What are your thoughts on that? Because that is the job of a union, to bring the employee to the table with their employees.
Well, of course, under this system, the trade union would be able to stand candidates. There may be independent individuals who might stand as well, but probably the strongest candidate to represent the employees at management level would be one sponsored and backed by the union, supported by the union, trained by the union, advised by the union, because the unions have that capacity. Now, going back in history, actually what I'm proposing, 1/3 employee and consumer directors, is in fact a very modest proposal. In the 1970s, the Labour government of Jim Callaghan, who's generally regarded as a Labour right-winger, commissioned Lord Bullock to do an inquiry into industrial democracy. And Lord Bullock, a fairly conservative figure, turns out to have been far more radical than me. He said every company with more than 50 employees should be required by law to have 50% employee representatives on the boards and a mutually agreeable chair, mutually agreed between management and Labour. Now, the sad fact is that those proposals were scuppered by the trade unions. The trade unions opposed them. They said this would lead to corporatism. This would lead to trade unions becoming part of the system. Well, my view at the time was, not if you elect the robust defenders of employees. If you send patsies to the management board, of course they'll be co-opted. But if you send robust fighters who will defend the interest of employees, you'll have someone there at the top table who can give you all the corporate information that the employers currently hide from you and can give you the voting rights to veto the bad things they're proposing. So that's the way I see it.
Okay, I'd like to take a question from Julia Horn. I think, Julia, you're here. That's good. I think it's an issue you touched on before about do you think a reform of the UK tax system and HMRC might actually increase the potential for democratic society? What are your thoughts on tax?
Well, I don't think taxation is necessarily, a motor force for greater democracy. I think it's certainly a greater motor force for social justice. If we had more tax revenue, we could build more affordable homes. We could build more homes for rent, and we could help thereby solve the housing crisis. We could also invest in the kind of energy conservation I suggested and in new renewable energy. Let's not forget that in the 1970s, Britain led the world in tidal and wave power. But Margaret Thatcher, in hoc to the big oil companies who were exploiting North Sea, didn't want that. So she cut all the funding, and those advanced programs had to be closed down. I'm just saying, if only they'd been sustained with investment, Britain could have now been a world leader in wave and tidal technology, which I think is the great untapped source of renewable energy. And you probably all know that Germany now gets something like 20% of its power from solar. But that is a bit come day, go day, depending on whether, it doesn't have to have the sun shining, but whether there's light or overcast. With tidal and wave power, it's constant, permanent, day in, night out, year in, year out. That's where we should be investing, and that's where I think extra revenues from taxation should be going. Do you want to explain how you think the connection with democracy?
Hiya. You said some of them earlier on, actually, but what I think would be really useful, I'm one of those minds that likes to think about how to do things. And what I would like to see is whichever political party got in actually work on reforming the system, the tax system. And an example of what I'd like to suggest would be that each big company had its own tax officer, that each big company was absolutely monitored by an individual person. And I would also go back to what you said about investment, because if you built up regional tax offices instead of having all your infrastructure in London with local people, local tax officers monitoring big business and industry, but also helping people, rather than having a personal financial advisor telling you how to use your money, the bits you talked about, 1/3 of the stock market is pensions. Well, we could do with talking to a tax officer instead of a personal financial advisor. So that's my outline plan so far.
Okay.
Thank you, Julia. I think we have the results of the ballot. Is that right? Or almost coming out? Yes. Thank you all for voting in this ballot, by the way.
Yes, turnout was moderate. Maybe I don't have a mandate, I don't know. So the results were that on the question of do you think democracy is in crisis, perhaps a self-selected sample, but overwhelmingly yes, 74% said yes, 26% said no. I just wonder now, actually, if we took a poll at the end, how the numbers would stack up. Might possibly be a slightly even more higher vote for yes, so it'd be interesting. Did anybody who said no, would they change their mind at this point? Has anybody who perhaps said they didn't think democracy was in crisis as yes? Okay, so you think yes now, right? So we've had one shift. Anybody gone the other way who said yes, I think democracy is in crisis, and now I don't think it is? No. Right, it's fairly resounding.
Yes, so I'd like to open it up for more general questions. I know I haven't addressed a few of these questions that are given out here, but I'd like to give you a chance, and then yourself. So the man in the green.
All right, I'm going to have to draw on American politics for this, and I'm sorry, but one thing that I've been noticing as I'm becoming more politically aware is that it seems like people join parties for the symbolic component rather than the party reflecting their actual views. So in the US, someone is either a Democrat or a Republican and therefore necessarily agrees with that party rather than holding independently determined views and determining which party represents them better. Another big part of that is I think a lot of people in the US just simply aren't informed. They don't have strong opinions one way or the other, and therefore they rely on this symbol. So my question for you is, do you think you need to have uniformly informed citizens to have a true democracy? And if so, how would you go about getting people more interested in investing in democracy?
Well, I think, take the education system. The purpose of education is to prepare young people for adult life. And part of the responsibility of adult life is to vote and to have your view expressed in the political system. I don't think most schools adequately address political issues and involve pupils sufficiently in being engaged, active citizens, which of course is not just about voting, but about lobbying, because, at the end of the day, democracy is not just about elections. If that was the case, then we'd all have about 12 chances in our lifetime, if we live long enough, to put a cross on a ballot paper. That itself is not democracy. That's part of democracy, but I think we need to engage with and hold governments and members of parliament to account 24/7 all throughout their tenure of office. So the role of lobbying and protest and campaigning is also a very important element of politics, and it can often be a successful one. And let's not forget that Margaret Thatcher introduced the poll tax, which, for those who don't know, was a flat rate tax to fund local services where the very poor paid the same as the very rich. A totally unjust system. She had a parliamentary majority. Incidentally, a parliamentary majority based on minority of votes. Margaret Thatcher's landslide in 1983 was based on about 40% of the vote. But because of first past the post, she had a massive landslide, I think of nearly I think a majority of nearly 200 seats. But anyway, using that flawed system, she got all those extra seats, and she introduced the poll tax. But most people understood that was unfair, that a person on a low or middle income should not be paying the same as a mega-rich millionaire. So people rebelled. And at first the rebellion was just protests, and I'm sure you know that hundreds of thousands of people protested in the streets. There were fine speeches in Parliament by the opposition, the Liberal Democrats, Labour, and others. At the end of the day, Margaret Thatcher had the votes to carry it. So the poll tax became law. And then what happened was people said, well, look, we're not having this. This is a blatantly unfair system. So hundreds of thousands of people either refused to pay the poll tax or delayed payments. And I got about 5 court summons, as did many, many other people, for delaying and refusing to pay. In the end, because of that non-payment or delayed payment protest, the system became unworkable. And Margaret Thatcher very reluctantly finally scrapped the poll tax. She said, of course, it would never, ever be scrapped. She said, this is a not negotiable policy. I've won this landslide vote in Parliament. This policy is staying. But at the end of the day, the mass protests, particularly from non-payment and delayed payment, forced her to back down. So it shows that when governments exceed their mandate, when they break their promises, when they do things for which they have no mandate, we are right to rebel against it. And if we're organized and determined enough, we can force the government to change. So that, to me, is as much democracy as voting in a polling booth.
I don't think that was in the manifesto either, was it?
No. No.
There was a question there. Yep.
Yes. I mentioned earlier that I thought a great deal of the protests across the world, suffer from the fact that they don't really know what they're against. They certainly are protesting about the conditions, but they really have no concrete answers. And listening to what you're saying, what you've said, and clearly, in other words, it's a very radical agenda in terms of the particular politics here in this country. But Cromwell said, nobody travels further than he who does not know where he is going. And it seems to me that not just in this country, but elsewhere where many of the symptoms and the phenomena that you describe, are shared, that we are living in a time when this crisis is the worst crisis, if you like, of the 20th century of contemporary capitalism. And Thomas Piketty, the French economist, in his tracing of the history, in other words, the development of capitalism, recently, pointed out that we are now in a phase of this global system whereby the conditions that have prevailed and are prevailing across the globe are not simply an aberrant phenomena. They are something that is going to continue and develop increasingly, because this system, this capitalist system, can only survive precisely on such basis. And therefore, the question I really want to ask you is, and it's a bit like the elephant in the room, how can we pose the reforms that you mention without explicitly arguing that the need for those reforms come from the bankruptcy of an economic international system, and that it has to be replaced, and that therefore to replace it, we have to have the concrete political alternatives, not just in this country, but on a global scale to address, indeed, the problems, as you say, of ecology are indeed, so absolutely fundamental for the survival of the human race. And therefore, I can't believe that I've listened to you for an hour and you haven't mentioned once that really that is the starting point, not the finishing point, but the starting point for any serious attempt to address the problems.
Okay, so Peter, what are your thoughts on an alternative economic philosophy that can counter the the problems we face today, do you think exists a concrete economic vision?
Well, with respect, I think I outlined several practical ideas about changing the way in which the economy might operate. And I agree, these are not the be-all and end-all, but they're the start of a journey in the right direction. There are limits to how far we can go and take public opinion with us. And these ideas that I've outlined tonight, as you say, are quite radical. I think if we go much further, we will not carry public opinion with us. And the important thing to do, of course, is to take public opinion with us, to convince people to begin this journey of transformation. And these are ideas which are not about merely propping up the system, they're about structurally reforming the way in which the system operates. I agree, quite modest, but, as I say, in the right direction. You are correct that we live in a world where the global system is failing at least a third of the world's people, if not more. Here I am drinking a glass of water. It tastes good, it won't harm me. This morning, 800 million people woke up on this planet with no safe, clean drinking water. That's an indictment of a global system where millions, in fact billions, live in a state of impoverishment and deprivation, while a handful of very, very rich people live in a state of fabulous, unbelievable wealth. I think Oxfam put out the statistic not long ago that the 85 richest individuals on this planet have as much wealth as the poorest 50% of the entire global population. That is not right. It's not sustainable. On the bigger issue, you're right that the imperative of free market capitalism is for growth. And we live in a planet with finite resources. Of course, we can find new alternatives and new technologies, but at the end of the day, overall, the biosphere is being degraded. The quality of air, the quality of water, the availability of water, the availability of food, the sustainability of soil to grow crops is diminishing year on year. And at the end of the day, something's got to give. And I would say that having a system based primarily on private ownership and private profit is not sustainable in the long term. That doesn't mean we go for a state socialist system like Russia or China once had, because they're now basically capitalist states as well. But it does mean that we reorient the economy towards a sustainable economics where the common good comes before private ownership and private profit, where we use the resources, the talents, the skills that we have to benefit the majority, not just to aggrandize wealth and power to the very rich.
There was a question here.
Just referring to a couple of points that you've mentioned about the voting being mixed between list MPs and local members. That's the election system in New Zealand. And what it leads to in New Zealand is that small radical parties get a lot of vote because of protest vote, practically. Same happens in Australia and the Senate, where you practically have the Australian Motoring Enthusiast Party making decisions about things like immigration, and the Australian Sex Party holding the power in Western Australia. Another side of it is also looking at things like telling people that you can get control over your finances, essentially your retirement funds. They allowed that in Australia. People withdrew their money, put it in property, raise the property prices through the roof. Is it that the system that we have, whether it's political or economic, depending on stupidifying people so they don't know how to make the right decisions, meaning that the same parties, same companies stay in power regardless of what happens, just make people idiots so they can get away with it?
On your point about small parties having power and having undue influence, it's called democracy. If people don't like it, they shouldn't vote for the smaller parties. And I agree with you that we need a political awareness and education so that people understand the implications, how the system works, and how their votes can make a difference. But at the end of the day, I think we need parliaments that represent a broad cross-section. And if people vote and make bad decisions to give, extreme or, fringe parties influence, then that's their fault. They have to live with that. We all have to live with it. But that's democracy. Democracy is about letting people decide and have their voice heard. What was the second part of your question?
The second part was mostly about, is the system deliberately stupidifying people, cutting funding to universities, to education, to everything, so they can stay in power? Because the less education you get, the more chance people are going to go to whoever the Daily Mail tell them to vote for.
I'd just like to quickly come back on that. Just because you have a university education, that doesn't mean you're not stupid. Yes, they can cut university. You can still have a lot of very intelligent people here. But Peter, yes.
I don't buy the conspiracy argument. I don't think some cabal sits down and says, how can we keep the people in ignorance and stupidity? But I think what happens is that people from a certain social, cultural, and economic milieu, by a process of amorphosis, come to a similar view and pursue similar policies. The end result is that, on the whole, I'd say that people in Britain and in most countries are not well informed about political issues and about political choices and alternatives.
And what about economic?
Well, the same with economic choices and options and alternatives as well. And that is the big challenge, to educate. And that is a role for the education system, without being politically partisan, can teach young people about economic and political issues and options. But also goes back to the responsibility of political parties and leaders to present alternatives and to argue for what they believe in, rather than simply seeking to appeal to what is the established consensus. If you're always going to appeal to the consensus, to the middle ground, that's a recipe for social stasis. You won't get change, you won't get resolution.
Take the lady next to you. Yeah.
My question actually was, thank you. Are we paralyzed by the huge gap between the older generation, and I say that with respect to few people, and the younger generation, because the older generation are obsessed with, they do have these older ideas about, obsession with investment, closed-minded against, cultures and so forth. And also the younger generation who are the middle class right now, and I think who are shrinking basically, and falling back to being lower classes. So, and the problem is with the older generation are the people who are voting for these political parties who are making those decisions and so forth. So do you think, are we paralyzed by the gaps between those two generations?
I think you're right. On the whole, older people tend to be small c conservative. That's true in this country and most countries. But I would caution against thinking that young people are automatically more radical and open-minded. There are a lot of the younger generation of university students who support the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats and Labour. They're part of the consensus. And I would say that overall, young people are not as vocal and not as politically engaged as they were in my generation. There are some fantastic young people doing great things in politics, but in terms of overall numbers and impact and the kinds of protest and campaign they do, is not as great as it once was. And that is part of the general depoliticization of our culture. I think people are increasingly, or have been increasingly, turned off politics, partly because they see the system as rigged and can't be changed, partly because they think that all politicians are the same, partly because they think politicians are corrupt, as we saw with the expenses scandal. There's a whole host of reasons. But at the end of the day, we have to work with what we've got. And again, it goes back to the argument, if you want to be respected and seen as offering something, you have to argue for what you truly believe in. And, this is the great Green mantra in this election, vote for what you believe in. Whatever that might be, vote for what you believe in. Don't vote tactically. Don't vote to keep the other guy out or the other girl out. Vote for what you believe in. And if more politicians address those people, then we might have a less conservative electorate. But I agree, that will take time. And, I know from my own experience, there are older people who, like you say, are generally more conservative. But if you go to them with ideas, you engage them in a respectful way, you provide evidence and arguments, a lot of them are open to change. The problem is very few politicians and media outlets are projecting those alternative ideas.
I think one question there, the lady in blue here.
Thank you. You tackled the issue about democracy and having the voice of the people heard. How would you place accountability here in this big picture? Do you think that democracy has meaning without accountability, without people being able to hold the government accountable for what they decide on?
Well, of course, you could say that elections are the mechanism of accountability, that every 3, 4, or 5 years, currently 5 years, people have a choice and an option to vote out the government if they disagree with it. But I would add an additional caveat. I've long supported the idea of the right of constituents to subject their Member of Parliament to a recall election. Now, the Conservatives and Labour and the Lib Dems are saying if they're convicted of a serious criminal offence. I say no. If electors disagree with the way a Member of Parliament has voted or spoken on an issue, like the Iraq War, like bankers' bonuses or whatever, if, say, 25 or 30% of constituents in a particular constituency sign a recall petition, then that Member of Parliament should be forced to re-stand for election, and the electors should have the option of voting them out. So that, to me, would keep Members of Parliament permanently on their toes and not give them the security of thinking, oh, I've been voted in, I'm secure for 5 years, I can say and vote however I like. That would be a very good, important mechanism for accountability.
On the issue of accountability, can I just get in a personal whinge of mine about the Chilcot inquiry? Now, that's an accountability mechanism that was supposed to be about the Iraq War. And it's been going on forever, and they've delayed the publication of the Chilcot inquiry because of the election. That's ridiculous. If they want, and it is absolutely, it enrages me that here's an accountability. This is an inquiry into why on earth did we go into war in Iraq that has been delayed, postponed, and it's preventing the whole participation in democracy because I don't see any accountability. Here's a mechanism that the civil service, the politicians have deliberately delayed because it could affect the elections. That, to me, is completely unjust. But sorry, I've digressed.
I don't think it's only because of the election. I think it's because, outrageously, Lord Chilcot has given all the people in the firing line the chance to comment and protest against the conclusions in the report. And he's even suggested that their self-defense to the allegations will be published. What inquiry allows, obviously at the initial stage, a person who's being accused has a right to defend themselves and to present their defense. But Lord Chilcot is going one step further. He's allowing all those people in the frame to comment on his report and to present alternative arguments. That's one of the reasons why it's not only delayed until after the election, they're now saying so many people like Tony Blair have raised so many objections, it probably won't even be published before the end of the year. And that is not the way inquiries are supposed to work. Inquiries are supposed to hear the evidence, come to a conclusion, present the report, not go back to the accused to give them a second bite of the cherry. All the people dead in Iraq haven't had a second chance. Why should Tony Blair get one?
I'm going to take some last questions all together. So I'll take the gentleman right at the back, in black. Yep.
Yeah, two hot issues with regards to democracy are TTIP and Devo Mank. I was wondering, if you'd offer your say on those two issues and what you think their effect will be for democracy and what we should do about them.
Can I just stack up a few questions?
No, do one at a time quickly.
One at a time?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Yep.
No to the first one and yes to the second. The transatlantic trade and investment deal is a very, very bad one. For those who don't know, it would basically give big corporations the opportunity to sue governments which took policy decisions adverse to their economic interests. It could, for example, open up further privatization, in fact, very likely to open up further privatization of the National Health Service. So again, it's giving corporate interests unrivaled political and legal power to challenge democratically agreed government decisions and policies. On the devolution issue, I've always argued that, well, not always, but for quite a long time, argued that when it comes to the issue of devolution, it shouldn't just be restricted to Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, that the English regions should have their own regional parliaments and assemblies. So we need to move, I think, to a proper, formal federal system to give the distinct regions of England a chance for self-government, to have tax-raising powers, to spend in their regions in the interest of their people. Because under the present system, as we all know, everything is far too weighted towards London and the southeast. And I think regional parliaments with proper local accountability would be a way to redress that London bias and also, providing the right people were elected, providing there weren't sort of yes men and women elected, to ensure that the regions operated their tax-raising power and spending powers in ways to benefit local communities.
Yes, men, women, and transgender people.
Sorry?
Yes, men, women, and
yes,
transgender people. Yes, please. Sorry, no,
Yeah.
just sorry. The man in the grey T-shirt. Yes.
Hi, I was just coming back to your point on the recall and direct democracy. Do you feel that if we implemented a system of direct democracy in some kind, that the kind of direct democracy branch should have some checks and balances to prevent things like have happened in California, where constitutional amendments have kind of gridlocked their tax system?
Can you think of any particular example here in the UK that you...
I don't really know of any direct democracy examples in the UK.
Yeah, I think that on some issues there may be a case for referendums. But I think that overall, referendums are quite difficult because there's nothing wrong with them in principle, but when you have big media magnates controlling much of the media, it does impact on what voices and arguments are heard. And I'm not saying that people are gullible and stupid, but if people are not presented with information, if they're not getting diverse sides of each argument, then how they vote in a referendum may not be a truly informed democratic vote. I think that certainly on Europe, although I'm very critical of the European Union and want to see it reformed, Basically, I think it is good that Britain works in cooperation with other European countries to tackle big issues like climate destruction, to ensure uniform rights for employees across the European Union, common standards on health and safety, gender equality, and so on. But I do also believe that we have now reached a state where it's probably a good idea to have a new referendum, because, of course, there was a referendum in 1975 where people voted to remain part of what was then the common market. But the European Union has evolved a lot since then. And I think we need to perhaps have a new vote to reconfirm and put to bed all the arguments about Europe. Thankfully, the most recent polls indicate that most people would want to stay within the European Union. But that alone is not enough. The European Union does need radical reform to make it more democratic, more accountable, and to give a greater priority to human rights and democracy and social justice. And so those are, to me, also part of the equation, not simply the in-out vote, but also a vote, or at least a debate or pressure or a campaign to ensure that Europe decentralizes more power and is more accountable and gives a higher priority to social justice. And that plays into the argument about devolution, because you could argue that if we had a truly devolved, decentralized European Union, you could have the Northwest having direct representation in Europe. That the Northwest would pay money into Europe, but also get money back to fund projects. That the Northwest could have its own vote in the European Parliament. Do we actually need the nation state? The nation state arose in the era of, first of all, feudalism, then colonialism and imperialism. Is it any longer necessary? Do we still need the old nation state of the feudal capitalist era? Might a transition to devolved regional powers within the framework of a federated, decentralized European Union, might that be the way to go in terms of giving regions a real voice and real power? It's a question.
I'm afraid that's all that we've got time for. Apologies to everybody that's have had their hands up but didn't get a chance to ask their question. I'd like to thank Peter once again for this opportunity to hear what his thoughts are on democracy and elections, and thank you all for coming today. And I especially have this phrase that you said earlier on about vote for what you believe in, and hopefully that's what we do next week. Thank you, Peter. Thank you.